I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week, we're going to be looking at the 2001 Oscars in a smaller independent family drama from a now sort of recluse filmmaker that I think is one of the best we've covered this season. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is pick a movie that was nominated for Best Picture that I believe has been forgotten to time. One movie that isn't as well talked about anymore, one that doesn't necessarily have a cult following or is well regarded or well appreciated. And many times I'm watching these movies for the very first time, and that's a good indicator as to which movies I thought were ultimately forgotten. But the show works in three parts. The first part, I talk about some of the historical context, where we were at the time of the Oscars, what other movies were nominated, was this a surprise nomination, things like that. Then I give my thoughts on the movie and a little bit of analysis, and then finally try to answer that age-old question as to why this movie was forgotten, why this movie and not another one, what does it have to do with sort of cultural impact. But this was the 2001 Oscars, which was the first Oscars post 9/11. Whoopi Goldberg hosted for her fourth time in 8 years, and her last time, she was sort of a staple at this time. You know, her and Billy Crystal really sort of, maybe on the Mount Rushmore up there of Oscar hosts, and she's sort of, even though she's only hosted 4 times, the amount of people that have hosted multiple times is still a rare list. This was also the first year of the Best Animated Feature category, in which Shrek beat out Monsters, Inc. and Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius. This was also the start of the Lord of the Rings performance. It got nominated, the very first one here, Fellowship of the Ring, got nominated for 13 Oscars and didn't win Best Picture, which is kind of a rare feat. Most of the time, so if you get 13, 14 nominations, you would ultimately win Best Picture. But it ultimately got us to 2 years from now. We've already talked about that on the Seabiscuit episode where I won everything. But this was sort of the beginning of that. Nevertheless, this was actually an Oscar race that was a little bit up in the air. First of all, the nominations were sort of hard to predict and difficult to predict. Things like Shrek got PGA and I think BAFTA. Moulin Rouge won the PGA. Lord of the Rings won the BAFTA. Beautiful Mind won DGA. Now, Beautiful Mind ultimately went on to win Best Picture. But the race for not only nominations, but also for the win was up in the air. I mean, some people thought Shrek was going to get nominated for Best Picture. So something like In the Bedroom was a bit of a surprise come Oscar night. It got 5 nominations, including sort of a surprise Marissa Tomei nomination and that picture nomination. But this really was a weird year for the Best Picture nominations because a movie like Lord of the Rings, which was so dominant, doesn't ultimately win for Best Picture. And then in terms of the actual nominations, 3 out of the 4 winners, acting winners, were from movies that only had 2 other nominations. As a matter of fact, this was a great year for African Americans in the acting categories. Denzel Washington won his long overdue Oscar, in my opinion, for playing Alonzo Harris in Training Day, the best lead actor. Of course, he'd won earlier for Glory, but he was only the second black actor to ever do it since Sidney Poitier in 1963. And similarly, on the same night, Halle Berry won for Best Lead Actress for Monsters Ball, and she was the first black woman to win for Best Lead Actress ever, and still. And both great performances and great movies. But because none of the acting wins ultimately got Best Picture nominations, and as a matter of fact, only 3 of the Best Picture nominees, directors, got nominated for directing, it was kind of a crapshoot as to the actual movies that got nominated for Best Picture weren't necessarily acclaimed in some of the other categories. But In the Bedroom, was the one that was a little bit of a surprise, like I said, because that surprised Marissa Tomei. Todd Field did not get a Best Director nomination, but it was clearly well appreciated, well liked by the Academy. But you have to wonder, its lack of cultural impact, even at the time, maybe was a reason why the movie ultimately became more and more forgotten. And, I started thinking about maybe this was similarly to last week's episode, a culmination of a genre. Last week we talked about how Chicago, it winning Best Picture was sort of the height and the peak of all of the musicals that were doing well, Hedwig and the Angry Inch, Moulin Rouge, things like that, doing well and finally culminating in Chicago's win. I think this year maybe you could put a little bit of a narrative to it in the sense that, the ice storm, frailty, I would even put this in the basket of A Simple Plan, kind of these sort of late 90s, early 2000s family dramas. They're sort of more sort of simplistic, but sort of dark and serious. All in sort of this sort of group, and maybe In the Bedroom sort of riding off that wave. Although In the Bedroom, despite winning Best Picture, still is a little bit more forgotten, because those movies, I mean, directed by Ang Lee, The Ice Storm, The Simple Plan, directed by Sam Raimi, they're still, well-acclaimed, Oscar-winning, in the case of Ang Lee, directors who are well appreciated, versus Todd Field has only made 2 films. And I think maybe that is a reason to why this movie wasn't, maybe as this well respected at the time, and definitely has been sort of forgotten to time over the years. It was a movie that, in my opinion, I didn't even realize it got nominated for Best Picture. I knew about it, but I sort of lumped it in with those kinds of movies. I didn't realize it was appreciated this much at the time. And then in terms of just more historical context, I think it is worth noting that this is the first post 9/11 Oscars, and where we talked about it last week, where the next year, actually 5 of the nominees were either period movies or fantasy movies, I think sort of reflecting the time of the country, which the Academy was largely American at the time. Particularly this year, I think, is also in a way a reflection of that. Now, you could always put, things on top of movies. Movies were released and had been made before the events, but the types of movies that the Academy chose, I think, were prevalent, because 4 out of the 5 nominees were either fantasy or some sort of period film. And the one film that was a contemporary film, In the Bedroom, is about grief and the unconsolable sort of way you move forward with that. I don't think that's a coincidence, in my opinion, that it was 4 escapism fantasy movies and then one movie that's trying to sort of confront the emotions and really resonate with the emotions of the country at the time of, going through this incredibly devastating event, and how do you cope and how do you go forward with that, and the sort of aimlessness of that. So now transitioning into my thoughts, I was really quite impressed by the movie. Like I said at the top, it was one of my favorites of this season so far that I've watched. And Todd Field is an interesting director, and I had a lot of fun sort of learning more about him, because he is one of those guys that you don't learn about until later in your film career, because he was mostly an actor and then transitions into directing, and then he makes this movie, which is well appreciated and acclaimed, and then 5 years later makes Little Children, which was less so but still got Oscars and was well liked, and then hasn't made a movie since, and has sort of been caught up in development hell, and supposedly has a new movie with Cate Blanchett coming out, but he's had a couple projects with Daniel Craig and Leonardo DiCaprio at one point, so he was sort of really stuck in this period. And maybe because these types of movies don't get made anymore, maybe because his name has lost a little bit of cachet, many things happen with sort of, I don't think he's necessarily in director jail, more so that he's sort of in development hell in many ways. But during his time as an actor, he was probably most notably in Eyes Wide Shut. So, of course, he learned a lot from Kubrick, I bet, right? He was directing the movie right as he was making Eyes Wide Shut, like right before it. So I'm sure he sort of bounced back ideas and whatnot. So in many ways, when I think of Todd Field, I kind of lump him into sort of these directors of 2000s who made sort of Kubrickian-inspired movies that have gone on to do great things, but then also have these long periods and stretches of no movies. Then guys like Jonathan Glazer or Bennett Miller come to mind. I mean, Bennett Miller does Capote, and then 6 years as Moneyball, and then Foxcatcher, and then nothing since. Similarly with someone like Jonathan Glazer, he does Birth, which I think is a very sort of Kubrickian-inspired movie, and then does nothing until 9 years later, Under the Skin. These guys who are, you don't really know too much about them. They're not someone like Spike Lee or Ridley Scott, or sort of always making movies. They are sort of, these make a movie, and then you'll never hear from them, and then all of a sudden, hey, there's a new movie coming out from Jonathan Glazer or something. There is sort of I sort of lump them into a category there. But this debut, while I actually probably like Little Children a little bit better, I do think this debut is still a remarkable achievement, and I'm still really excited to see what Todd Field's next movie is going to be, because of how sort of confident this movie is and how patient the movie is. It's a slow family drama about a husband and a wife, their son, and his girlfriend he's dating, who also has a sort of a dangerous ex-husband because he had 2 children with the wife, so it's sort of a college-age boy dating and a little bit of an older working-class woman. And then sort of the events that happen there, I don't want to spoil the movie, but about 40 minutes into the movie, there is sort of like a chronicling event that changes how people relate to each other, and really the movie is about that event and how you sort of cope and respond to something of that magnitude. Now, when I say slow, it is slow. I think, it's 2 hours and 11 minutes. It could probably be chopped down 10 or so minutes, but its strength is really in that slowness, in the patience that is really described here, because once that event happens, the second half is in many ways aimless. There is not sort of a driving force, like we need to get X and we're going on a journey to get that, to, we have to go through these obstacles, like maybe a blockbuster movie. It really is sort of like an aimless movie. But what Todd Field does so aptly, I think, is through his writing, is really able to show the parallels between sort of the first third and the second third, and how, a relationship that was so clearly defined in these 40 minutes, which was really incredible, changes so much, and what is said, or even more so, what is not said in that sort of second third, how often these smaller moments of story and relationship building are told and communicated to the audience without dialogue. Things like Sissy Spacek looking at Tom Wilkinson's character when he's, gives him sort of a glance that seems to indicate that he's drinking more than usual. Even just, stuff that, Sissy Spacek maybe says underneath her breath. The way Tom Wilkinson diverts attention away from certain things in the conversation. These smaller certain things that are not necessarily actually said within the script, but are communicated to the audience through that subtext. And because of this sort of second half, which is aimless, there's sort of like a malaise that goes over the film, and days blend together, and you don't know when things are happening and what day of the week it is, and it's sort of all blurring together, which I think does a great job at sort of conveying the themes and of the film and of the actual experience itself. But then, of course, I'd be remiss not to talk about Tom Wilkinson and Sissy Spacek, which I think delivered some of maybe their best performances of their career, which is a testament to both of them, because they're both legendary, well-respected actors, yet they're still not on that level of something like Anthony Hopkins. They're still not on the level of one of the greats, even though they may be deservingly of that. Specifically, I think someone like Sissy Spacek, which I think is maybe one of my favorite actors of all time. I mean, I love her earlier work in Badlands and Carrie, but then, I think some more underrated performances, something like The Old Man and the Gun, or The Straight Story, she's great in, and then something like this, some people maybe have forgotten about In the Bedroom and haven't thought about it in a while, and she's so great in this, and she's been so great for so many years. So I'm really glad that she got an Oscar nomination for this. And both her and Tom Wilkinson really did deserve it. It's special performances by the two of how they're really able to take this really well-written and really complex kind of a story and elevate it and communicate that as much as the writing does, that so much of it is still reliant on the actors to communicate stuff to us through their gestures. Because, if you say something in the script, a gesture is supposed to communicate this, well, that is most of the time almost always on the actor. And then, of course, how things are framed and whatnot. But the movie really is sort of a great sense of a feat of writing, I think, but also sort of confident directing and patience, and it's not trying to do things flashy. It really is allowing things to sort of breathe, and the direction, of course, of the performances that he gets out. So it's a real sort of combination and a confident and impressive directorial debut, I think, by Todd Field. But why was this movie forgotten? Well, I think there's a bunch of reasons. First, it has the unfortunate sort of killer combination of being the two leads are not box office movie star actors, so they don't have sort of their own, big fan base. Like, I'll watch every Leonardo DiCaprio movie, for example. Then it's a director who has sort of been more of a recluse. A lot of people don't even know what he's doing, or we just hear stuff. Hollywood Reporter, there's a new Todd Field project, but we've heard that a lot before. He hasn't made a movie since 2006, so we don't know when his next movie is going to happen or if it's going to happen. So for a lot of people, they don't get to watch Todd Field movies until later in their career. I mean, I learned about someone like Christopher Nolan more before I learned about someone like Todd Field, even though they were sort of, had their directorial debuts in the early 2000s. And funnily enough, I was actually watching The Sopranos, and there's a scene where Tony Soprano gets a brand new sort of surround sound system, and Carmela, his wife, says, oh, she's going to pick up In the Bedroom to watch on the TV on the new surround sound, which is, I think, kind of a testament to how the movie was perceived even at the time, which was this movie that's sort of a serious adult drama, not for kids. And in an era where Space Jam New Legacy just came out, nostalgia and four-quadrant movies are the dominant force of popular entertainment. Movies like this not only are not being made anymore, so therefore they're not being sort of remembered. I mean, we remember Ghostbusters because there's a new Ghostbusters movie every 4 years, but we don't remember something like In the Bedroom because there's no movies that are inspired by In the Bedroom that are coming out to their big sort of cultural movies that are even getting nominated for Best Picture even. So not only are these movies not getting made, not only was this movie in particular, has no big stars, not only, and then also on the top of the fact of that is that Todd Field is kind of a recluse director who doesn't have a sort of younger fan base that always is talking about him or sharing about him. So there's all these different combinations, unfortunately, that lend to the fact that this is a little bit more of a forgotten movie, but it shouldn't. It's a really terrific movie, so if you haven't seen In the Bedroom in a while, or you remember liking it but haven't seen it in a while, I do think you should check it out once again to be reminded of how good it is. And if this sort of new Todd Field, Cate Blanchett movie is going to happen, which I really hope it does, maybe I'll cover it on this channel too, who knows. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below, like the video, subscribe to the channel. New videos every Monday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. But that's about it, guys. Until next time, stay tuned.